The military base buzzed with its usual morning activity as soldiers moved with practiced efficiency across the compound. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across the training grounds where recruits practiced their drills. In the main administration building, Captain Marcus Henderson sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing the day's assignments with a furrowed brow. He was a tall man in his early 40s, with sharp features and a commanding presence that had been earned through 20 years of distinguished service. The sound of boots echoing down the hallway caught his attention. Henderson glanced up from his paperwork as his assistant, Lieutenant Davis, appeared in the doorway. Davis was a young officer, eager to please and always punctual. He saluted crisply before speaking. "Sir, the new transfer has arrived. She's waiting in the outer office." Henderson nodded without looking up from his documents. "Send her in." The door opened wider, and a young woman stepped into the office. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, of average height, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun. Her uniform was crisp and proper, but there was something unremarkable about her appearance that made her blend into the background. She carried herself with quiet confidence, though her eyes held a certain wariness as she took in her surroundings. "Private Sarah Mitchell reporting for duty, sir," she said, offering a precise salute. Henderson barely glanced at her before returning his attention to the papers before him. "At ease, Private. I've reviewed your file. Standard infantry training, no special qualifications, average marks across the board." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with barely concealed indifference. "Tell me, Mitchell, what makes you think you're cut out for this unit?" Sarah lowered her hand, but maintained her rigid posture. "I'm here to serve, sir. I'll do whatever is asked of me." A slight smirk crossed Henderson's face. "Generic answer. I expected as much." He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "You'll be assigned to 3rd Platoon under Sergeant Morrison. Basic duties, nothing complicated. We have high standards here, Mitchell. Don't expect any special treatment." "I don't expect any, sir." Henderson dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Report to the quartermaster for your bunk assignment." "Dismissed." Sarah saluted again and turned to leave, but not before she caught the skeptical look that passed between Henderson and Lieutenant Davis. It was a look she had seen many times before, one that questioned why she was even there. She closed the door behind her and allowed herself a small breath before making her way down the corridor. The barracks were a long, rectangular building with rows of bunk beds separated by tall metal lockers. Sarah found her assigned spot near the far end, where several other soldiers were already settled in. As she began unpacking her duffel bag, she became aware of eyes watching her. 3 soldiers stood nearby, their conversation dying as they turned their attention to the newcomer. The tallest of them, a broad-shouldered man with a crew cut and a scar above his left eyebrow, stepped forward. His name tape read Corporal Jackson. He looked Sarah up and down with an expression that mixed curiosity with dismissal. "So you're the new transfer," Jackson said, crossing his arms. "Private, huh? What did you do to get sent here?" Sarah continued folding her clothes, placing them neatly in her locker. "Just following orders, Corporal." Jackson exchanged glances with his companions, both of whom snickered. "Following orders. Right. Let me guess, you put in for a transfer because you thought this would be an easy posting." "I didn't put in for anything. I was assigned here." "Even worse," one of the other soldiers chimed in, a wiry man named Perkins. "That means they didn't know what else to do with you. Probably couldn't hack it at your last unit." Sarah closed her locker and turned to face them, her expression neutral. "Is there something I can help you with, Corporal?" Jackson's smirk widened. "Just making sure you understand how things work around here. We don't have room for dead weight. Everyone pulls their share, and then some. Think you can handle that, Private?" "I'll manage. We'll see about that." Jackson turned away, motioning for his friends to follow. As they walked off, Sarah heard their muffled laughter and whispered comments. She had expected this. New arrivals always face scrutiny, especially when they came with unremarkable records and no apparent specialization. The rest of the day passed in a blur of orientations and briefings. Sarah was introduced to Sergeant Morrison, a gruff veteran with a weathered face and a no-nonsense attitude. He ran through the unit's schedule, expectations, and chain of command with mechanical efficiency. There were no words of welcome, no attempt to make her feel included. She was simply another body to fill a roster slot. During the evening meal in the mess hall, Sarah sat alone at a corner table, eating her food in silence while around her dozens of soldiers laughed and talked in tight-knit groups. She observed them carefully, noting the social hierarchies and informal alliances that formed the backbone of military life. Captain Henderson sat at the officers' table, surrounded by his senior staff. He never once looked in her direction. After dinner, the soldiers gathered in the common area for a briefing on the next day's training exercises. Henderson stood at the front of the room, his posture rigid and his voice carrying the weight of authority. He outlined a series of tactical drills that would test the unit's readiness and coordination. These exercises are not optional, Henderson emphasized, his eyes scanning the assembled troops. I expect peak performance from every single one of you. There is no room for mediocrity in this unit. Those who can't keep up will be transferred out. Am I clear? A chorus of "Yes, sir," echoed through the room. Sarah joined in, her voice lost among the others. She noticed several soldiers glancing in her direction, their expressions ranging from indifference to outright skepticism. The message was clear. She would have to prove herself, and, even then, acceptance was not guaranteed. That night, as she lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, Sarah replayed the day's events in her mind. The dismissive attitude from Captain Henderson, the mockery from Corporal Jackson, the cold reception from virtually everyone she had encountered. It was all part of a pattern she had grown accustomed to over the years. People saw what they expected to see, nothing more. In the darkness, she allowed herself a small smile. They had no idea who she really was or why she was there. And that was exactly how it needed to be. For now, she would play the role of the unremarkable Private Mitchell, the forgettable transfer with average credentials. She would endure their mockery, their dismissiveness, their casual cruelty. Because when the time came, when the moment arrived that would reveal her true purpose, their laughter would die in their throats. Captain Henderson would discover that his cursory glance at her file had missed the most important details. The secret she carried was not written in any official record. It existed in the shadows, known only to a select few at the highest levels of command. Sarah closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, her breathing slow and steady. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of her patience and resolve. But she had faced worse before. She had trained for scenarios that most soldiers couldn't even imagine. And when the critical moment arrived, she would be ready. The base settled into its nighttime rhythm, the distant sound of boots on patrol routes mixing with the occasional bark of orders from the night watch. In his office, Captain Henderson finished his paperwork and locked his files away, never suspecting that the unremarkable private he had so easily dismissed would soon become the most important person on the entire base. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the story that would unfold in the coming days would challenge everything Henderson thought he knew about rank, duty, and the true nature of military service. The wake-up call came at 5 in the morning, a harsh electronic bell that shattered the peaceful silence of the barracks. Sarah was already awake, sitting on the edge of her bunk and lacing up her boots. Around her, soldiers groaned and stumbled out of bed, some more alert than others. She moved efficiently through her morning routine, making her bed with crisp hospital corners and ensuring her uniform was immaculate. The training grounds were shrouded in early morning mist as 3rd Platoon assembled for their first drill. Sergeant Morrison stood before them, his breath visible in the cold air. He held a clipboard and wore an expression that suggested he had seen 1,000 recruits come and go, and none of them had particularly impressed him. "Today we're running an obstacle course," Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the morning chill. "Time trials. Your performance will be logged and reviewed by Captain Henderson. Fall behind the standard time, and you'll be running it again. And again, until you get it right, or until you collapse. Either way works for me." The course was brutal. It stretched across 2 miles of rough terrain, incorporating rope climbs, wall scaling, crawling sections through mud, and a final sprint across uneven ground. Sarah took her position at the starting line alongside 11 other soldiers. Corporal Jackson was 2 positions to her left, already stretching his legs and rolling his shoulders with the confidence of someone who had run this course dozens of times. Morrison raised his whistle. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. The sharp blast sent them surging forward. Sarah paced herself carefully. She didn't rush to the front of the pack, nor did she lag behind. She maintained a steady position in the middle, her breathing controlled and her movements economical. The first obstacle was a series of wooden walls, each one progressively higher than the last. She watched the soldiers ahead of her attack them with brute force, some struggling to pull themselves up. When her turn came, she approached each wall with calculated precision. Her foot placement was exact, her grip sure. She cleared them without wasted motion, neither fast enough to draw attention nor slow enough to seem incompetent. Behind her, she heard Perkins cursing as he failed his first attempt at the highest wall. The rope climb came next. 20 feet of thick rope suspended over a mud pit. Sarah gripped the rope and began her ascent, hand over hand, her legs wrapped around the rope for stability and leverage. Her arms burned with the effort, but she kept her pace steady. She reached the top, slapped the bell that hung there, and descended with controlled speed. Corporal Jackson was already through the mud crawl section by the time Sarah reached it. The narrow tunnel was barely 2 feet high, forcing soldiers to drag themselves on their stomachs through thick, cold mud. She dropped down and began pulling herself forward, the mud seeping into her uniform and coating her face. It was miserable work, and she could hear soldiers ahead of her grunting with effort and frustration. She emerged on the other side covered in filth, but still moving steadily. The final sprint was uphill, a punishing climb that tested whatever energy remained in tired legs. Sarah pushed herself harder here, knowing that finishing too slowly would invite unwanted criticism. She crossed the finish line in the middle of the pack, her time respectable but unremarkable. Morrison checked his stopwatch and made a note on his clipboard. Mitchell, 11 minutes 42 seconds. Acceptable. Barely. He didn't offer any praise, but he also didn't single her out for criticism. She had done exactly what she needed to do, blend in. The soldiers who finished after her received harsh words from Morrison, while those who finished ahead got curt nods of approval. Corporal Jackson had posted the fastest time at 9 minutes 18 seconds, and he made sure everyone knew it. As the platoon gathered for the post-drill briefing, Jackson deliberately positioned himself near Sarah. Not bad for a transfer, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Of course, you were barely ahead of Williams, and he's nursing a knee injury. But, hey, at least you didn't come in last. Sarah didn't rise to the bait. She simply nodded and focused her attention on Sergeant Morrison, who was outlining the afternoon's activities. Jackson seemed disappointed by her lack of reaction and moved away to share his triumph with more receptive audience members. The rest of the morning was dedicated to weapons training. The platoon assembled at the firing range, where rows of targets stood at various distances. Sarah collected her assigned rifle and found a position at one of the firing stations. She had always been a decent shot, good enough to pass qualifications, but not so exceptional as to draw special attention. The range officer called out the commands. Load. Aim. Fire at will. The crack of gunfire filled the air as soldiers took their shots. Sarah squeezed her trigger with practiced control, placing her rounds in a tight grouping on the target. Not perfect center mass, but consistent and effective. Good enough to satisfy requirements, not good enough to impress anyone. Captain Henderson appeared at the range midway through the exercise, walking along the line of shooters with his hands clasped behind his back. He paused here and there to observe specific soldiers, occasionally offering a comment or correction. When he reached Sarah's station, he barely slowed down. Mitchell, he said without looking directly at her, your grouping is adequate, but lacks precision. Work on your breathing control. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, never taking her eye from the sight. Henderson moved on without another word. Sarah continued firing, her expression unchanged. She had received exactly the kind of lukewarm assessment she expected. To Henderson, she was just another average soldier going through the motions. Nothing special, nothing to remember. Lunch was a brief affair in the mess hall, where tired and dirty soldiers refueled for the afternoon ahead. Sarah sat at the same corner table as the day before, eating her meal in silence. She was aware of the conversations happening around her, the casual camaraderie that she was not part of. A few tables away, Jackson was entertaining his group with an animated story about a previous training exercise, complete with exaggerated gestures and sound effects. The afternoon brought tactical drills. Third platoon was divided into 2 squads and given a simulated combat scenario. One squad would defend a position while the other attempted to breach it using cover, movement, and communication. Sarah found herself assigned to the attacking squad under the direct supervision of Lieutenant Davis. Davis was younger than most of the other officers, perhaps only 30 years old, but he carried himself with the earnest determination of someone eager to prove his worth. He gathered the squad and outlined their approach, using a sand table to illustrate key terrain features and planned movements. "Mitchell, you'll be part of the flanking team," Davis said, pointing to a position on the sand table. "Your job is to move around the left side while the main assault draws their attention. Stay low, use available cover, and wait for my signal before advancing." "Understood." "Yes, sir." The drill began with Davis giving the signal. The main assault team moved forward, their blank ammunition creating a steady rhythm of simulated fire. Sarah and 2 other soldiers broke off to the left, moving quickly between trees and rocks. She kept her head down and her eyes scanning for threats. The defending squad had positioned themselves well, with overlapping fields of fire that made a direct assault costly. But the flanking maneuver was working. Sarah and her team reached a position where they could see the defenders' exposed side. She raised her hand to signal their position to Davis. That's when one of her teammates, a soldier named Reynolds, made a mistake. Instead of waiting for the signal, he jumped up and charged forward, eager to be the hero who broke through the enemy line. His movement immediately drew fire from the defenders, and the drill referees marked him as a casualty. "Reynolds is down," one of the referees shouted. "Flanking team, your position is compromised." Sarah made a split-second decision. She rolled to her right, taking cover behind a fallen log while her other teammate, a quiet soldier named Chun, did the same in the opposite direction. The defending squad shifted their focus toward the flanking position, exactly as Sarah had anticipated. This created a brief opening in their main defensive line. Sarah keyed her radio. "Lieutenant Davis, center is exposed." 5 seconds. Davis, to his credit, recognized the opportunity immediately. The main assault team surged forward in those 5 seconds, overwhelming the distracted defenders. The drill referees blew their whistles, signaling the end of the exercise. "Attacking squad wins," the head referee announced. Time, 14 minutes, 30 seconds. Lieutenant Davis jogged over to Sarah's position, a slight smile on his face. "Good call on that radio communication, Mitchell. You saw the opening and reported it. That's exactly the kind of awareness we need." Sarah stood and brushed dirt from her uniform. "Just following the situation, sir." Davis nodded and moved on to debrief the rest of the squad. Sarah noticed Captain Henderson standing on a small hill overlooking the training area. He had watched the entire exercise, but his expression remained unreadable. If he had been impressed by her tactical awareness, he gave no indication of it. That evening, after another communal dinner where Sarah once again sat alone, the soldiers gathered in the common area for a brief period of downtime. Some played cards, others wrote letters or read books. Sarah found a quiet corner and pulled out a worn paperback novel, more as a prop than anything else. She wanted to observe without appearing to do so. Corporal Jackson and his group were playing poker at a nearby table, their voices loud and boisterous. Jackson was in the middle of another story, this one about his time at a previous posting where he had supposedly single-handedly resolved a crisis situation. The details seemed exaggerated, but his audience was either too polite or too entertained to challenge him. "So there I was," Jackson said, dealing another hand of cards, facing down 3 armed hostiles with nothing but my sidearm and my wits. Command was screaming in my ear to pull back, but I knew if I didn't act, civilians were going to die. "What did you do?" Perkins asked, leaning forward eagerly. "I did what any good soldier would do. I assessed the situation, identified the leader, and took him out with 1 shot. The other 2 surrendered immediately. Crisis averted, civilians saved, another day in the life." The group murmured their appreciation, though Sarah noticed a few skeptical looks from the more experienced soldiers nearby. Jackson's stories always seemed to cast him as the hero, the one man who could solve impossible problems. It was a common trait among soldiers who felt the need to constantly prove their worth. Sarah turned her attention back to her book, or at least appeared to. In reality, she was processing everything she had learned about the unit's dynamics over the past 2 days. She had identified the informal leaders, the social structures, the weak points in both morale and discipline. Captain Henderson ran a tight ship, but there were cracks beneath the surface. Rivalries, resentments, and the inevitable personality conflicts that arose when strong-willed individuals were forced into close quarters. The lights-out call came at 10 o'clock. Sarah returned to her bunk and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to maintain her carefully constructed facade. She had successfully made it through 2 days without drawing suspicion or revealing anything beyond what her official records showed. As she drifted off to sleep, her last conscious thought was about timing. Everything depended on timing. Too soon, and her purpose here would be compromised. Too late, and the situation might deteriorate beyond the point of recovery. She would know when the moment was right. She had been trained to recognize it. Outside, the base settled into its nighttime routine once again. Guards walked their patrols. Officers reviewed reports. And Captain Henderson, sitting in his office with a glass of whiskey, reviewed the day's performance logs. His finger paused briefly on Sarah Mitchell's entry, noted her adequate times and scores, and moved on without a second thought. The trap was being set, though only one person on the entire base knew it. And that person was lying in her bunk, breathing slowly and evenly, waiting with infinite patience for the right moment to reveal that nothing about this situation was what it seemed. The third day brought an unexpected change to the routine. During morning formation, Sergeant Morrison announced that 3rd Platoon would be participating in a joint exercise with units from 2 other bases. The operation would simulate a complex hostage rescue scenario, testing coordination, communication, and adaptability under pressure. It would take place the following week, giving them 5 days to prepare. This exercise is being watched by higher command, Morrison said, his weathered face more serious than usual. Our performance will reflect on this entire base. Captain Henderson expects excellence. I expect excellence. You will deliver excellence, or you will answer to me. Dismissed. The announcement created a buzz of excitement and nervousness throughout the platoon. Joint exercises were relatively rare and carried more weight than standard training drills. They were opportunities for individual soldiers to shine, but also chances for units to be embarrassed in front of their peers from other bases. Sarah noted the increased tension as she moved through her daily duties. Corporal Jackson seemed particularly energized, already boasting about how he would demonstrate superior tactics during the exercise. Lieutenant Davis spent hours in consultation with Captain Henderson, planning their approach and assigning specific roles to each squad member. The preparation days were intense. The platoon ran through scenario after scenario, each one designed to test a different aspect of their training. Sarah continued to perform at her established level, competent but unremarkable. She executed her assigned tasks efficiently, communicated clearly, and made no significant mistakes. She also made no spectacular displays of skill that would draw special attention. However, on the 4th day, something changed. The platoon was running a building clearing exercise, moving through a mock structure room by room. Sarah was positioned as the 3rd person in a 4-person team. As they approached a doorway, the point person, a soldier named Martinez, gave the signal to breach. The team moved in with practiced coordination, each person covering their assigned sector. But Martinez had missed a detail in his initial assessment. There was a second entrance to the room, partially concealed by a curtain. As the team focused on clearing the main area, a training instructor playing the role of a hostile combatant emerged from the hidden entrance. Sarah saw him a fraction of a second before anyone else. Without thinking, she spun and raised her training weapon, calling out, "Contact right." Her reaction was so fast, so instinctive, that the instructor barely had time to raise his own weapon before she had him marked. Hostile neutralized, the exercise referee called out. Good reaction time, Mitchell. The team completed the room clear and moved on, but Sarah immediately recognized her mistake. She had reacted too quickly, too professionally. The movement had been pure muscle memory from training that wasn't in her official record. Martinez and the other team members gave her appreciative nods, but she also noticed Lieutenant Davis watching her with a slightly puzzled expression. After the exercise, Davis approached her during the break period. "Mitchell, that was some impressive reaction time back there. Where did you train before coming here?" Sarah kept her expression neutral. "Basic infantry course, sir. Same as most." "Really?" "Because that wasn't a basic infantry reaction. That was advanced close-quarters training. The kind of thing Special Operations does." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I pay attention during drills, sir. I learn from watching the experienced soldiers." Davis studied her for a moment longer, clearly not entirely satisfied with the answer, but unable to articulate why. Finally, he nodded. "Well, keep up that level of awareness. We need that kind of performance next week." "Yes, sir." As Davis walked away, Sarah silently cursed herself. She had let her training override her caution. It was a small slip, easily explained away, but it was still a crack in the facade she had worked so carefully to maintain. She would need to be more careful going forward. That evening, as she sat in the mess hall eating dinner, she became aware of a different kind of attention. Several soldiers who had previously ignored her now glanced in her direction with renewed interest. Corporal Jackson, however, seemed less impressed than suspicious. He sat at his usual table, speaking quietly with Perkins and another soldier, occasionally looking towards Sarah with narrowed eyes. After dinner, as Sarah walked back to the barracks, Jackson intercepted her in the hallway. He wasn't alone. Perkins and a third soldier, a heavy-set man named Burke, flanked him on either side. "Mitchell," Jackson said, his voice lacking its usual mocking tone. "We need to talk." Sarah stopped and faced them. "About what, Corporal?" "About you. See, something doesn't add up. You show up here with a file that says average everything. No special training, no notable achievements, nothing that suggests you're anything more than basic infantry. But today I watched you clear that room, and that wasn't basic anything. That was the kind of reaction time that comes from serious training." Sarah kept her voice level. "I got lucky. I saw movement and reacted. That's all." "Lucky," Jackson repeated, his tone skeptical. "Right. And I suppose you were also lucky on the tactical drill 2 days ago, when you spotted that opening in the defensive line before anyone else, including Lieutenant Davis?" "I was in the right position at the right time." Perkins stepped forward slightly. "Come on, Mitchell. We're not idiots. You're hiding something. Why else would someone with real skills pretend to be average?" Burke, who hadn't spoken yet, added his voice. "Maybe she's a plant. You know, sent here by command to evaluate us or something." Jackson waved him off. "That's paranoid thinking, Burke." But Perkins has a point. "Mitchell, if you've got skills, why hide them? Are you trying to make the rest of us look bad? Is this some kind of game to you?" Sarah felt the situation escalating and knew she needed to defuse it carefully. These men weren't threats in the traditional sense, but their suspicion could complicate everything. She considered her options and chose the path that would seem most believable. "Look," she said, injecting a note of frustration into her voice. "You want the truth? I washed out of advanced training. Made it most of the way through, picked up some skills, but couldn't cut it when it counted. They sent me back to basic infantry, and I've been trying to keep my head down ever since. I don't advertise the training because it reminds me of failure." "Is that what you wanted to hear?" The explanation hung in the air. It was plausible, even tragic in the way military careers could be. Jackson exchanged glances with his companions, and Sarah could see them processing the story. It fit with what they had observed, explained her skills while also explaining why she seemed so unremarkable on paper. After a long moment, Jackson's posture relaxed slightly. "Advanced training, huh? What program? Does it matter? I didn't make it. I'm here now, same rank as when I started. That's all that counts." Perkins seemed sympathetic. "That's rough, man. I knew a guy who washed out of Ranger School. Messed him up pretty bad." Burke nodded in agreement. "Yeah, that makes sense. Sorry for jumping on you like that, Mitchell." Jackson still looked somewhat skeptical, but he stepped back. "All right, fine. Just don't get any ideas about showing off during the joint exercise. We're a team, and teams work together. No individual heroics that make the rest of us look bad." Got it, Corporal." The 3 men walked away, their suspicions apparently satisfied. Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The lie about washing out of advanced training was a risky gambit, but it had worked. It gave her cover for any skills that might accidentally slip through while also explaining why she seemed reluctant to display them. But the encounter had revealed something important. She was being watched more carefully now. The joint exercise would be a critical moment. Too much performance, and her cover story would collapse. Too little, and she might miss the very opportunity she was waiting for. The next 2 days passed in a blur of final preparations. Captain Henderson became increasingly involved in the planning, personally overseeing tactical discussions and making adjustments to the unit's approach. He ran additional drills, pushed the soldiers harder, and made it clear that failure would not be tolerated. During one of these final drills, Henderson called Sarah aside. She approached him with appropriate deference, wondering if her earlier slip had somehow reached his attention. "Mitchell," he said, consulting a tablet in his hands, "Lieutenant Davis mentioned you showed good awareness during the building clear. That's the kind of performance I want to see in the joint exercise. Don't overthink things, but stay sharp." "Understood." "Yes, sir. Your file says you're just average, but average isn't going to cut it next week. I need every soldier performing at their peak. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded. "I'll do my best, sir." Henderson studied her for a moment, his eyes searching for something he couldn't quite identify. "Good." Dismissed. As Sarah walked away, she felt the weight of multiple watchful eyes. Henderson, Davis, Jackson, and probably others were all paying closer attention to her now. The challenge was maintaining the delicate balance she had established while also preparing for the moment when that balance would need to be deliberately shattered. That night, she lay in her bunk thinking about the week ahead. The joint exercise would bring soldiers from 2 other bases, along with higher-ranking officers who would observe and evaluate. It would be a complex, chaotic environment with multiple moving parts. Exactly the kind of situation where unexpected things could happen. She thought about the secret code she carried, the words that only a handful of people in the entire military knew. The code that would transform her from Private Sarah Mitchell, unremarkable transfer, into something else entirely. But the code could only be used under specific circumstances, and those circumstances had not yet materialized. Patience, she reminded herself. Everything depended on patience and timing. The pieces were moving into position, even if no one else realized it. Captain Henderson thought he was preparing for a routine joint exercise. Lieutenant Davis thought he was refining tactics. Corporal Jackson thought he was protecting his status as the platoon's informal leader. None of them knew that this exercise would become something far more significant than any of them anticipated. None of them knew that Sarah Mitchell had been specifically selected and placed in this unit for reasons that had nothing to do with her official record. And none of them knew that when the critical moment arrived, the laughter that had greeted her arrival would transform into something very different. She closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, secure in the knowledge that she had successfully navigated another challenge. The cracks in her facade were small and easily explained. The suspicions that had briefly flared were now soothed by a plausible lie. She remained exactly where she needed to be, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the signal that would change everything. In his office, Captain Henderson finished his evening paperwork and shut down his computer. He thought briefly about the upcoming exercise, running through contingency plans and backup strategies. His unit would perform well. He would make sure of it. His reputation depended on it. He never gave Private Mitchell another thought that evening. She was just one soldier among many, a small part of a much larger machine. In a week's time, he would discover just how wrong that assessment was. But, for now, he remained blissfully unaware that the most important person on his entire base was the one he had dismissed as utterly average from the very first moment they met. The morning of the joint exercise arrived with unusual weather. Dark clouds had rolled in overnight, bringing with them a steady drizzle that turned the training grounds into a slick, muddy terrain. Sarah stood in formation with the rest of 3rd Platoon, rain dripping from her helmet as Captain Henderson addressed the assembled units. 2 other companies had arrived during the night, their vehicles parked in neat rows near the administrative buildings. Sarah recognized the insignias from Fort Carson and Camp Pendleton. These were experienced units with strong reputations. The exercise had attracted an impressive audience of senior officers, including a colonel from Regional Command who stood under a covered observation post, watching everything with hawk-like attention. Henderson's voice carried across the grounds despite the rain. Today's exercise will test everything we've trained for. The scenario is a hostage situation in a hostile urban environment. Alpha Company will act as the hostile force. Bravo Company will provide perimeter security and support. Our unit, 3rd Platoon, will execute the primary rescue operation. Sarah felt the weight of those words. Henderson had assigned them the most visible, most critical role in the entire exercise. It was a high-risk, high-reward position. Success would bring recognition and praise. Failure would be public and humiliating. The hostages are in a 3-story structure designated Building 7. Henderson continued. Intelligence suggests multiple hostile combatants with unknown capabilities. Rules of engagement are in effect. Civilian casualties will result in immediate mission failure. Time limit is 45 minutes from go signal. Questions? No one spoke. Henderson nodded with satisfaction. 3rd Platoon, report to staging area Delta. Move out. The platoon jogged through the rain to their staging area, where Lieutenant Davis had spread a detailed map across a tactical table under a temporary shelter. He gathered the squad leaders around him while the rest of the soldiers checked their equipment and prepared their gear. Sarah stood with her squad, methodically checking her weapon and gear one last time. Corporal Jackson was nearby, doing the same, but she noticed he kept glancing toward the observation post where the senior officers stood. He clearly felt the pressure of performing in front of such an important audience. Davis called the platoon together. Listen up. We're going with a 3-pronged approach. 1st squad takes the main entrance after breaching. 2nd squad comes in through the western side entrance. 3rd squad, you're the reserve force, and will respond to whichever team needs backup. Mitchell, you're with 3rd squad under Sergeant Morrison. Sarah nodded. Being in the reserve force was actually a tactical advantage. It gave her flexibility and the ability to respond to developing situations. Morrison was an experienced leader who made quick, sound decisions under pressure. It was an ideal position for what she needed to do. The platoon moved into position, spreading out around Building 7, while maintaining communication through their radios. Sarah crouched behind a concrete barrier with the rest of 3rd Squad, watching the structure through the rain. It was a standard 3-story building with multiple windows and 2 visible entrances. The hostile force would be watching those entrances, waiting for the assault. Henderson's voice came through everyone's radio. All units, stand by. Exercise begins in 60 seconds. Sarah controlled her breathing, her mind shifting into the heightened state of awareness that came from years of specialized training. She had run scenarios like this dozens of times, but always with her true identity known. This was different. This time she was playing a role within a role, constrained by the expectations of who everyone thought she was. Go, go, go. Henderson's command crackled through the radio. 1st Squad hit the main entrance with a breaching charge, the simulated explosion sending smoke billowing into the rainy air. 2nd Squad rushed the western entrance simultaneously. The sound of blank ammunition filled the air as both teams engaged with the hostile force inside the building. Contact, main entrance. Heavy resistance. The voice belonged to the 1st Squad leader, stress evident in his tone. 2nd Squad is pinned down. Multiple hostiles, 2nd floor. Another voice, equally tense. Sarah listened to the radio traffic while watching Morrison for the signal to move. The veteran sergeant was calm, processing the incoming information and waiting for the right moment to commit his reserve force. This was the critical decision point: where and when to reinforce. Then, everything started to go wrong. The exercise evaluators had introduced a complication that hadn't been part of the briefing. Through her position, Sarah saw smoke beginning to pour from the 3rd floor of the building. Real smoke, not from weapons fire. The evaluators had set a controlled fire to add chaos to the scenario. Fire on 3rd floor, someone shouted over the radio. Hostages are on 3rd floor. Repeat, hostages on 3rd floor with active fire. The mission parameters had just changed dramatically. The hostages needed immediate extraction, but both assault teams were engaged with the hostile force on the lower floors. Morrison made his decision. 3rd Squad, we're going in through the Eastern Service entrance. Mitchell, Chun, your point team. We move fast, and we move smart. Let's go. Sarah and Chun sprinted from their cover position toward the eastern side of the building. This entrance was smaller, designed for maintenance access, and presumably less defended. They reached the door and stacked up, weapons ready. Chun tried the handle and found it locked. Locked, he reported. Sarah stepped forward. I've got it. She pulled a small tool from her vest pocket, working the lock with practiced efficiency. In less than 10 seconds, she heard the click of the mechanism giving way. The door swung open. Morrison was right behind them. How did you? Never mind. Move. They entered the building, immediately encountering the disorienting environment of a combat scenario. Smoke, noise, and the constant crack of simulated gunfire created a sensory overload that would freeze inexperienced soldiers. Sarah moved through it like she had done this 1,000 times before. Third squad cleared the ground floor rapidly, encountering minimal resistance. The hostile force had concentrated their defense on the main entrances where the primary assault was happening. Morrison directed them to a stairwell leading upward. Second floor first, he ordered. Clear any hostiles. Then, we moved to third for the hostages. They ascended the stairs in tactical formation. Sarah was second in the stack now, Chun having moved to the rear. As they emerged onto the second floor landing, they encountered 3 hostile combatants. The simulated firefight was brief, but intense. Sarah moved with fluid precision, her training taking over despite her conscious effort to restrain it. She cleared her sector, called out targets, and worked in perfect coordination with Morrison and the rest of the squad. The hostile combatants were marked as neutralized by the exercise evaluators. Second floor clear, Morrison reported over the radio. Moving to third floor for hostage extraction. The smoke was thicker on the third floor, the controlled fire creating realistic but safe conditions for the exercise. Sarah could hear coughing coming from behind a door marked with red tape, the designated hostage location. But between them and that door stood 2 more hostile combatants, positioned to protect against exactly this kind of rescue attempt. Morrison signaled the squad to halt. We need to breach that door fast, but those hostiles have us in a crossfire position. Mitchell, Chun, you take the one on the left. Burke, Mendez, you take right. On my mark. Sarah assessed the situation in a fraction of a second. The hostile on the left was partially concealed behind a desk, with a clear field of fire down the hallway. A direct assault would result in simulated casualties. But she noticed something the others hadn't. A service duct above the hostile's position, partially open. Sergeant, she said quietly, I can flank left hostile through the service duct. Give me 20 seconds. Morrison looked at her with surprise. You sure? Yes, Sergeant. Do it. Fast. Sarah slung her weapon across her back and moved quickly to where the duct entrance was accessible. She pulled herself up with athletic ease, squeezing into the narrow passage and crawling forward through the darkness. She could hear the hostile combatant below her, probably watching the hallway and waiting for Morrison's assault. She reached a grate that overlooked the hostile's position, worked it open silently, and dropped down behind him. Her weapon was up, and aimed before the exercise evaluator had time to call it. Left hostile neutralized, the evaluator announced. With the crossfire broken, Morrison and the rest of the squad took down the right hostile quickly. They rushed to the hostage door and breached it, finding 5 training mannequins marked with red tape to represent civilians. The squad began extracting them efficiently, carrying them toward the stairwell. But, as they moved, Sarah heard something through her radio that made her blood run cold. It was a transmission from outside the building, from Captain Henderson's position. All units, be advised, we have actual movement on the perimeter. This is not part of the exercise. Repeat, actual movement detected. Unknown personnel approaching from the north side. The entire exercise came to a sudden, jarring halt. Evaluators were calling out for all units to cease fire and hold positions. Sarah's mind raced. Unknown personnel approaching during a training exercise. Multiple bases represented. Senior officers present. This was exactly the kind of situation that her real mission had prepared for. She moved to a window and looked out through the rain. In the distance, she could see figures moving through the tree line north of the compound. They were trying to stay concealed, but their movements were coordinated and purposeful. This wasn't random civilians who had wandered onto the training grounds. Morrison had seen them too. What the hell is this? Through her radio, Sarah could hear confusion spreading among all the units. The exercise had been designed to be realistic, but this was something else entirely. Henderson's voice cut through the chatter, trying to establish control. All personnel, return to your staging areas immediately. This is not a drill. Security protocols are now in effect. Move. Sarah's squad began moving toward the stairwell with the rest of the soldiers. But she noticed something that made her pause. One of the figures outside had separated from the others and was moving toward a specific location, the observation post where the colonel and other senior officers were stationed. Her training identified the threat immediately. The coordination, the timing during a joint exercise when security was focused inward rather than outward, the direct approach toward high-value targets. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was an actual security breach, and it was happening right now. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She keyed her radio to the command frequency, the one reserved for senior officers. When she spoke, her voice was different from the uncertain private everyone had known. It was calm, authoritative, and carried absolute certainty. Command, this is Mitchell. I need immediate eyes on the northern perimeter, focusing on the observation post. We have a potential hostile approach on senior officers. Request permission to engage security protocols. There was a moment of stunned silence on the radio. Then, Captain Henderson's voice, sharp and confused. Mitchell, what are you doing on this frequency? Return to your squad immediately. Sarah ignored him. Colonel Winters, are you receiving this transmission? The colonel's voice came through, cautious but interested. This is Winters. Who is this? This was the moment. Everything Sarah had been waiting for, everything she had been sent here to do, came down to the next few seconds. She took a breath and spoke the words that would shatter every assumption everyone had made about her. Sir, my name is Major Sarah Mitchell, Defense Intelligence Agency. Authorization code, Crimson Shepherd 77 Delta. I am requesting immediate implementation of security protocols and full tactical authority over this situation. The silence that followed was absolute. Every radio frequency went dead quiet. In the building, Morrison stared at her with his mouth open. Chin looked like he had been struck by lightning. Outside, Sarah could imagine the shock on Henderson's face as he processed what he had just heard. The colonel's voice returned, now sharp and focused. Major Mitchell, stand by for code verification. Sarah waited, counting the seconds. She knew what was happening. The colonel would be checking with his aide, who would be pulling up classified databases, entering her authorization code, and confirming her identity. It would take perhaps 30 seconds for them to discover that the unremarkable private they had all dismissed was actually a senior intelligence officer conducting a covert security evaluation, and that the exercise they thought they were running had just become something far more dangerous and real than any of them had imagined. The 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Sarah stood at the third-floor window, her eyes tracking the approaching figures while her mind calculated distances, angles, and response times. Behind her, Sergeant Morrison and the rest of 3rd Squad remained frozen in place, their earlier mission forgotten in the face of this impossible revelation. Morrison finally found his voice. Major? You're a major? Sarah didn't turn around. Not now, Sergeant. We have a situation developing. The radio crackled back to life. It was Colonel Winters, and his tone had changed completely. Code verified. Major Mitchell, you have tactical authority. What do you need? The transformation in the room was immediate. The soldiers who had been staring at Sarah in shock suddenly straightened, their expressions shifting from confusion to attention. Even Morrison, a 20-year veteran, instinctively adjusted his posture when addressing her. Sarah's voice remained calm and professional. Sir, I count 6 individuals approaching from the north. Their movement pattern suggests military training. They're using the exercise chaos as cover to approach the observation post. I assess this as a planned infiltration with senior officers as potential targets. Can you identify them? Negative, sir. They're maintaining distance and using available concealment. But their timing is too precise to be coincidental. Request permission to intercept with 3rd Squad. There was a brief pause. Sarah could hear urgent conversations happening in the background at the command post. Then, Winters spoke again, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Permission granted, Major. Base security is being mobilized, but they're 5 minutes out. You're our closest response. Captain Henderson, you are directed to provide Major Mitchell with whatever support she requires. The radio silence from Henderson was telling. Sarah could imagine him standing at his command post, his face pale as he processed the fact that the private he had dismissed as utterly average was not only a major, but had apparently been conducting some kind of covert operation under his nose. When Henderson finally spoke, his voice was strained. Understood, Colonel. Mitchell, what are your orders? Sarah turned from the window and looked at Morrison and the squad. They were watching her with a mixture of shock and uncertainty, but also with the discipline of trained soldiers awaiting orders. She had their attention now, but she needed their trust and cooperation. Sergeant Morrison, I know you have questions. I'll answer them later. Right now I need you to trust me and follow my orders exactly. Can you do that? Morrison's jaw clenched, but he nodded sharply. Yes, ma'am. Good. Here's the situation. 6 hostiles are approaching the observation post using this exercise as cover. They think everyone is distracted and confused. They're wrong. We're going to intercept them before they reach their target. She moved to the squad, addressing each member directly. Chun, you're the fastest. I need you to take a radio and get to the observation post. Alert the colonel's security detail and establish a defensive perimeter around the senior officers. Chun didn't hesitate. On it, ma'am. Burke, Mendez, you'll take elevated positions on the 2nd floor with clear sight lines to the north approach. If shooting starts, you provide covering fire. Morrison, you and I are going to take the remaining squad members and move to intercept. Questions? There were none. The squad moved with sudden efficiency, their shock giving way to the automatic responses of their training. Chun was already running down the stairs. Burke and Mendez positioned themselves at 2nd floor windows. Morrison gathered the remaining 3 soldiers, checking their weapons and gear with practiced speed. Sarah keyed her radio to the command frequency. Captain Henderson, I need you to maintain the exercise perimeter. Don't let anyone leave the training grounds. If these hostiles have an extraction plan, we need to cut it off. Henderson's response came faster this time, his professionalism overriding his shock. Understood. All units, lock down the perimeter. No one enters or exits without authorization. Sarah led Morrison and the squad down the stairs and out of the building. The rain had intensified, providing natural cover as they moved quickly toward the north side of the compound. She could see the observation post in the distance, where Colonel Winters and the other senior officers were now surrounded by their security details. Chun had reached them and was gesturing toward the approaching threat. Through the rain and trees, Sarah caught glimpses of the infiltrators. They had slowed their approach, perhaps sensing that something had changed. Their element of surprise was evaporating. She needed to force their hand before they could withdraw and disappear. Morrison, take your team and flank them from the east. I'm going to approach from the west. We box them in and force them to either surrender or reveal themselves. Radio discipline from here on. Morrison looked at her with newfound respect. You've done this before. Many times, Sergeant. Move out. The squad split and moved through the terrain with tactical precision. Sarah's mind was operating at peak efficiency now, analyzing terrain, calculating approach angles, and anticipating responses. This was what she had been trained for over years of specialized operations that had nothing to do with basic infantry training. She moved through the trees, her weapon up and ready. The rain masked sound and reduced visibility, working both for and against her. She could see 2 of the infiltrators ahead, crouched behind a fallen log and watching the observation post. They were wearing civilian clothing, but their body language and equipment suggested military or paramilitary training. Sarah keyed her radio once, a brief click that told Morrison she was in position. She received an answering click. They were ready. She took a breath and stepped out from cover, her weapon aimed at the 2 infiltrators. Military police. Don't move. Hands where I can see them. The reaction was immediate. The 2 infiltrators spun toward her voice, reaching for weapons concealed under their jackets. But before they could clear leather, Morrison and his team emerged from the opposite direction, weapons trained on them. Drop your weapons. Now, the infiltrators froze, caught in a perfect crossfire with nowhere to go. After a tense moment, they slowly raised their hands. Sarah moved forward cautiously, never taking her eyes off them. As she got closer, she noticed something that made her reassess the situation entirely. One of them was wearing a small pin on his collar, partially hidden by his jacket. It was a training facility identification badge. These weren't actual hostiles. They were part of the exercise. Sarah's mind raced. If these were exercise participants, then why hadn't they been announced? Why the covert approach? Why the timing that suggested actual infiltration? She kept her weapon trained on them while reaching for her radio. Colonel Winters, I've detained 2 individuals on the north perimeter. They're wearing training facility badges. Can you confirm if they're part of the exercise roster? There was a long pause before Winters responded. When he did, his voice carried a tone Sarah hadn't heard before. Something between embarrassment and relief. Major Mitchell, stand by. We're checking now. The rain continued to fall as Sarah and Morrison kept the 2 detained individuals covered. One of them, a man in his 40s with graying hair, finally spoke. Are you going to shoot us? Or can we explain who we are? Sarah's weapon didn't waver. Identify yourself. John Pearson, Department of Defense Inspector General's Office. We're conducting a security evaluation of this joint exercise. Our approach was deliberately designed to test response protocols. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. You weren't announced to the unit commanders. Correct. Part of the evaluation is assessing how units respond to unexpected security threats during exercises. You just passed that test, by the way. Very impressive response time. The radio crackled. Colonel Winters' voice carried a mix of frustration and vindication. Major Mitchell, identities confirmed. They're Inspector General evaluators. Stand down. Sarah lowered her weapon, but didn't holster it. Sir, with respect, this creates a serious problem. We have multiple units on high alert, believing there's an active security threat. Someone needs to explain this situation before it escalates further. Agreed. Bring the evaluators to the command post. We're sorting this out now. As Sarah and Morrison escorted the evaluators back toward the command post, she became aware that the entire base was watching. Word had spread with impossible speed about the private who turned out to be a major. Soldiers lined the pathways, staring openly as she passed. The laughter and mockery of a week ago had been replaced by stunned silence and whispered conversations. Captain Henderson was waiting at the command post, standing in the rain without seeming to notice it. His face had gone through several shades of emotion and landed on carefully controlled professionalism. When Sarah approached, he saluted sharply. Major Mitchell, my apologies for my previous conduct. I was not informed of your actual rank or mission. Sarah returned the salute. At ease, Captain. You weren't supposed to be informed. That was the point. Henderson's jaw worked as he processed this. So this entire week, you were evaluating us? Testing our security protocols. Among other things. The Defense Intelligence Agency has been concerned about security gaps during joint exercises. I was inserted as an unremarkable transfer to assess whether units maintain proper vigilance even with personnel they consider inconsequential. Colonel Winters emerged from the command post with the Inspector General evaluators in tow. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had commanded men in actual combat. When he looked at Sarah, there was approval in his eyes. Major Mitchell, well done. Your response to what you perceived as a genuine security threat was textbook. The Inspector General's office was testing one thing. You were testing another. And somehow you both ended up testing each other. He allowed himself a slight smile. The irony is not lost on me. One of the evaluators, the man named Pearson, stepped forward. Major, your security assessment was on point. You correctly identified suspicious movement, properly escalated through the chain of command, and coordinated an effective response. If we had been actual hostiles, you would have neutralized the threat. Sarah nodded. Thank you, sir. Though I should point out that my cover was nearly compromised several times during the week. Private conversations and observation skills from experienced NCOs can detect inconsistencies even in carefully constructed covers. Henderson made a sound that might have been a laugh or a groan. So when you picked that lock in under 10 seconds, or when you flanked through the service duct, or when you spotted that tactical opening during the drill, those were all moments where your real training showed through. Correct. I had to carefully balance maintaining my cover with performing well enough to not draw suspicion for incompetence. It's a difficult line to walk. Lieutenant Davis appeared, looking like he had just run across the entire base. He stopped short when he saw Sarah, his eyes widening. Private Mitchell is a major? How did I not see this? Because you weren't supposed to, Lieutenant, Colonel Winters said. That's rather the point of deep cover operations. The colonel turned to address the growing crowd of soldiers who had gathered. Listen up, everyone. What you witnessed today was a convergence of two separate security evaluations. Major Mitchell of the Defense Intelligence Agency was conducting a covert assessment of our security protocols. The Inspector General's office was conducting an unannounced test of our response to unexpected threats. Both assessments are now complete, and I'm pleased to say that, despite some initial confusion, this unit performed admirably. He paused, letting his words sink in. You should all take pride in how you responded when Major Mitchell revealed her identity and took command of the situation. Despite your shock, you followed orders, maintained discipline, and executed your missions. That's the mark of professional soldiers. Sarah noticed Corporal Jackson standing at the edge of the crowd, his face cycling through emotions like a slideshow. Shock, disbelief, embarrassment, and, finally, something that might have been grudging respect. When their eyes met, he looked away, unable to hold her gaze. Sergeant Morrison approached her, his weathered face showing a mix of emotions. Ma'am, I need to apologize. I never should have treated you the way I did. Sarah shook her head. You treated me exactly as you would treat any average private, Sergeant. That was appropriate given the information you had. You have nothing to apologize for. Still, I gave you grunt work, ignored your input, never asked if you had skills that could benefit the unit. And, in doing so, you revealed exactly what I needed to know, how this unit treats its newest and least experienced members. That's valuable information for my assessment. Morrison considered this, then asked the question that was probably on everyone's mind. So what happens now? Are we all going to be disciplined or something? No, Sergeant. The purpose of this assessment wasn't to punish anyone. It was to identify systemic issues in how we conduct joint exercises and maintain security. My report will recommend procedural changes, additional training in threat recognition, and better integration of security awareness into exercise planning. But, individual soldiers, you all did exactly what you should have done given the information you had. Colonel Winters dismissed the crowd, and the soldiers dispersed, their conversations animated and speculative. Sarah found herself standing with Henderson, Morrison, and Lieutenant Davis. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunlight was breaking through the clouds. Henderson cleared his throat. Major, I need to know, was my conduct part of your evaluation? Sarah met his eyes steadily. Captain, you run a disciplined unit with clear expectations and professional standards. You treated a new private exactly as you should have, with appropriate skepticism and measured expectations. The fact that you didn't recognize my actual rank or skills is not a failure on your part. It's evidence that my cover was effective. But I dismissed you. I barely gave you a second thought, as you should have, given my file and initial performance. If you had immediately recognized something special about me, it would have indicated either poor operational security on my part or suspicious hypervigilance on yours. Your response was normal and appropriate. Henderson absorbed this, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. So I'm not going to be relieved of command? Captain, my assessment is going to note that you run an effective unit with good morale and solid tactical fundamentals. The security gaps I identified are systemic issues, not command failures. As the officers dispersed to their duties, Sarah found herself alone for the first time since the revelation. She walked slowly back toward the barracks, aware of the eyes still following her. The transformation from Private Mitchell to Major Mitchell was complete, but it came with its own complications. She thought about the past week. The mockery from Jackson, the skepticism from Henderson, the isolation from her peers. It had all been necessary, all part of the mission. But it had also been lonely in ways that surprised her. She had spent a week being treated as invisible, inconsequential, forgettable. That night, there was a knock on her door. She had been reassigned to officers' quarters, a private room with actual amenities. When she opened it, she found Corporal Jackson standing there, his posture stiff and formal. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" "Granted, Corporal." Jackson struggled with his words for a moment. "I want to apologize for how I treated you. The comments, the mockery, the suspicion. It was unprofessional and inappropriate." Sarah studied him. "Corporal, you treated me the way you treat most new privates. You were protecting your status in the social hierarchy, testing to see if I would be a help or a hindrance to the unit. That's natural behavior in military groups. But I made it personal. I went out of my way to make you feel like you didn't belong. And that revealed important information about unit cohesion and how new members are integrated. Your behavior, while not admirable, was instructive." Jackson looked at her with something like wonder. "How do you do that? How do you turn everything into a learning experience?" Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "Years of training, Corporal, and the understanding that people usually do the best they can with the information they have. You didn't know who I was. I made sure you couldn't know. That's on me, not you." After Jackson left, Sarah sat on her new bed and, finally, allowed herself to process the week's events. The mission had been successful. She had identified security gaps, tested response protocols, and gathered valuable intelligence on how units functioned during joint exercises. Her report would be comprehensive and actionable. But she had also learned something else, something that wasn't in any mission brief or training manual. She had learned what it felt like to be genuinely invisible, to be the person no one noticed or valued. It had given her a perspective that years of officer training had never provided. The next morning, she stood in Captain Henderson's office one final time. He looked more composed now, his initial shock replaced by professional curiosity. "Major, if I may ask, how many of these assessments have you conducted?" "This was my 7th deep cover placement in 3 years. Each one different. Each one revealing unique insights. And do you always choose to present yourself as unremarkable?" Sarah nodded. "Almost always. People pay attention to extremes, the exceptional and the terrible. But the average? The adequate? Those people blend into the background. They become invisible. And invisible people see everything." Henderson leaned back in his chair. "I'll never look at a new transfer the same way again." "Good. That means my work here wasn't wasted." Sarah stood and offered her hand. "Thank you for your cooperation, Captain. You run a good unit. Be proud of that." As Sarah prepared to leave the base, word of her story had spread beyond the immediate unit. Soldiers she had never spoken to approached her with newfound respect. Officers she had never met wanted to shake her hand. The private who had been laughed at and dismissed was now the major everyone wanted to know. But Sarah knew the truth. The respect she received now was based on rank and revelation. The dismissal she had received before was based on perception and assumption. Neither one captured the full reality of who she was or what she had accomplished. She climbed into the vehicle that would take her to her next assignment, wherever that might be. As the base disappeared in the rearview mirror, she thought about the secret code she had spoken. Crimson Shepherd 77 Delta. A combination of words that had transformed her from one thing into another in a matter of seconds. But the real transformation hadn't been about rank or authority. It had been about understanding. Understanding what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. Understanding how easily assumptions could blind people to reality. Understanding that the most dangerous threats often came from the directions no one was watching. Captain Henderson stood at his office window, watching the vehicle drive away. His phone rang, and he answered to find Colonel Winters on the line. "Captain, I just wanted to let you know that Major Mitchell's preliminary report came through. It's glowing in its assessment of your unit's capabilities and response times. She's recommending your unit for additional responsibility in future joint operations." Henderson felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, sir. Though I have to admit, I'm still processing the fact that I had a major under my command for a week and never knew it." Winters chuckled. "Don't feel bad, Captain. According to her file, she once spent 3 months embedded with a Special Forces unit as a supply clerk. The unit commander wrote her a standard evaluation praising her organizational skills. 2 months later, he discovered she was actually a colonel conducting a readiness assessment. Apparently, he went white as a sheet when she revealed her identity. At least I'm not alone in my embarrassment. None of us are, Captain. That's rather her specialty. Making colonels and generals feel foolish is practically her superpower. After the call ended, Henderson sat in silence for a moment. Then, he pulled up the personnel file for every soldier in his unit. He spent the next hour reading through each one carefully, noting details he had previously glossed over, asking himself questions he had never bothered to ask before. Because if there was one lesson he had learned from Private Major Sarah Mitchell, it was this: the person you dismiss as average might be extraordinary. The soldier you ignore might be the most important one in the room. And the laughter you direct at someone's rank might die in your throat when they speak the words that change everything. In a small apartment 3 states away, Sarah Mitchell sat at her desk and began writing her report. She documented security gaps, procedural weaknesses, and recommendations for improvement. But she also included something unusual: a section on human factors and the dangers of assumption-based assessments. She wrote about Corporal Jackson's need to maintain social dominance, about Captain Henderson's efficient but somewhat dismissive leadership style, about the way even experienced soldiers like Sergeant Morrison could overlook valuable skills because they didn't match their expectations. And she wrote about the lesson she hoped they had all learned: that in a world where threats could come from anywhere, the greatest vulnerability was not physical security or tactical preparation. It was the human tendency to stop seeing what we think we already know. The report would be read by generals and policymakers. Changes would be implemented. Training protocols would be revised. And somewhere, on another base or in another unit, Sarah Mitchell would do it all again. A different cover, a different rank, a different challenge. Because in the end, the secret code wasn't just a series of words that revealed her identity. It was a reminder that reality was always more complex than perception, that truth often hid behind assumptions, and that the most important revelations came when we learned to see past the surfaces we had accepted as the whole story. The laughter had died. The truth had been revealed. And Captain Henderson, like so many commanders before him, had learned that sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the most important message, if only we're wise enough to listen.